welcome back to episode 7 of the Dugout Debate. As usual, I am joined by Chris and Josh. Guys, how you doing?
Pretty good, actually. Thanks.
Yeah, good as always.
Good. There's lots of really good chat to be had today. Loads of stuff's gone on since we last recorded the last episode. So let's just launch straight into it, as we normally do, with our picture of the week, which shows a very distraught-looking Hatem Ben Arfa. And, guys, what could be possibly happening in this picture? Chris, I'll come to you first.
Well, I feel like this may be a leaked image from Doctor Strange 2, and he's just using his mind control powers or whatever.
Josh?
Is it, how did our one subscriber react, or how's he going to react when he finds out that you're recording today, Alex?
Cheers, mate. Appreciate the support. Chris, any less offensive suggestions?
Is this a poster for Home Alone 5, Lost in Barcelona?
That's actually quite... I'm actually quite impressed with that, Chris. That's quite a good one. I don't know why I'm so surprised, but... well in, son.
We normally fake laugh at Chris. This is genuine, so fair play.
That was actually quite good.
No need for the laugh track this week.
Josh, what are you saying?
Is it... How did the entirety of Scotland react when Nicola Sturgeon announced her plans for Indie Ref 2?
We said no political joke. We have one rule on this podcast. That's Josh to keep his political views to himself.
It's normally Chris, though. You're not me.
I'll agree that Indie Ref 2 is just stupid, but I digress.
Anyway, for another time.
Is this, I feel like this could be a meme, and it's like, when you don't pull out and she shows up 9 months later.
What does that mean, Chris?
You're speaking from personal experience, mate.
I can't
Considering we agreed that your love life was gut-wrenchingly sad a couple of weeks ago, I don't know how much you know about that situation, Chris.
Why are you describing it as gut?
We may have a fourth member of the Dugout Debate in a few years' time, but anyway, Josh, what is this picture actually saying?
No, this is PSG celebrating their loss against Barcelona.
Celebrating their loss against Barcelona? No,
the PSG player is completely deflated by one of the most miraculously amazing comebacks in football history against Barcelona.
Of course, and of course, the idea of comebacks is something we will revisit in the actual debate at the end of the episode. But yes, Josh's right. This is going back to something that did happen a little while ago from the time of recording, but the amazing comeback that Barca managed from 4-0 down in the first leg against PSG, then needing another 3 goals, having been 3-0 up, and Cavani scoring a crucial away goal, but managing to bring it back from the 84th minute onwards. And it's something we'll come on to, like I said, a bit later, but Chris, I'll come to you first on this one. Is this the best comeback ever?
Well,
simple question.
Yes.
More so than the one that you're going to pick later on.
We may as well just not.
Well, to be fair, we didn't allow this as like an option for the ones later on, so it's still a fair comment.
No, it's just absolutely incredible. It just shows the incredible class that Barcelona have in that team. I have firm belief that MSN is the best front three in pretty much in the world. So, and of course, it's not just them who were banging in the goals. I mean, Sergio Roberto's goal in the dying minutes of the game to give Barcelona the win was just absolutely astonishing. And that's going to be it'll be a massive boost for Luis Enrique, even though he's going to leave Barcelona at the end of the season. This could be the start of some sort of final hurrah for him at the Camp Nou, I believe.
Fair enough. And Josh, a more sort of specific question, I guess. If I'm sure you'll remember, I think it might have been 2004 or 2005, that another Brazilian of Barcelona by the name of Ronaldinho, of course, very well known, did one of the greatest individual performances we've ever seen against Real Madrid, earning a standing ovation from the Real Madrid supporters at the Bernabeu.
Yeah.
And people have been lauding the performance of Neymar, especially in the dying minutes of this game. Do you think this ranks as one of the best individual performances of all time? Of course, the composed way that he assisted the final goal, the incredible free kick he put in to score their 4th goal, and of course putting away the penalty to score their 5th. Where does this rank in terms of the greatest individual performances we've seen in recent times and of all time?
I think it's hard to give it an actual numerical rank, but if you compare Ronaldinho, who was at his time the greatest player there was, the thing about Neymar is he's in a trio of great players, and I think that's what separates him from Ronaldinho. Ronaldinho was an amazing player in a team of generally pretty good players, whereas Barcelona at the moment are a team of absolutely quality players. That front three of MSN, as you were mentioning, that's not a trio that you'd find anywhere else in any football team in history. So
True.
I think the way that Neymar is, his individuality is different from Ronaldinho's, is that he contributes to a trio, which in turn contributes to the team. Whereas Ronaldinho is very much the star of the show. So I think, yes, Neymar's performance was outstanding. We can't disagree with that for 1 second. But I think in this instance, it's a case of celebrating the performance as a team and not just singling out one player for his expertise during the game.
Fair point. And I'll pose this one to both of you, because I think this is something that's been quite hotly debated in the aftermath of the game. Should we be looking at this game in the context of an incredible Barcelona performance or a absolute PSG capitulation? And I know you could say an element of both, but if you had to pinpoint one of them as the key factor, which one would you pinpoint? Josh, I'll come to you first on this one.
I think one's conducive to the other. I think I don't know if PSG were quite expecting Barcelona to be firing off all cylinders as they were. It obviously caught them off guard because they just could not hack it for 1 second. But it comes to a point where it just shows Barcelona's resolve. When PSG did get that goal through Cavani, sort of towards the end of the game, Barcelona, I think they still had to score 3 goals. So you could say that maybe PSG were starting to find their way in the game a bit as Cavani got that goal, and that would have given them confidence. They then had the away goal. But Barcelona's resolve, their determination, their strength, their chemistry, their unity, I could go on with listing these different aspects. The fact that they managed to still score 3 goals, win the tie, overturn that 4-goal deficit is remarkable. So I think it was a bit like when we were talking about City and Monaco last week, when you said that, City winning wasn't just Monaco playing poorly, it was City being really good. And I think this is definitely an example of that, with Barcelona showing at its absolute optimum the class that they can display against a PSG team who probably were a bit complacent. I think it would be quite hard to disagree with that argument. But without question, it's a case of Barcelona just being phenomenal on the day and catching PSG out.
Fair enough. And Chris, just before I come to you for basically the same question, just to add something in that has influenced my opinion on the matter, for me, I have to look at it in many extents as a PSG capitulation, purely because, in my opinion, Unai Emery came out in the first game with tactics that were absolutely brilliant. They pressed Barcelona hard. They didn't give them time on the ball. You saw players like Messi and Iniesta, who never normally make mistakes on the ball, giving away passes, loose passes, running into PSG defenders. And that's something that helped PSG play so well. And if I were Unai Emery, I would have gone into that second game, regardless of the fact you're defending a 4-0 lead, I would not have gone in going, I'm happy to lose this game 3-0. I would have gone in wanting to win that game and playing the exact same way I played in the first leg. And he came into that game, from my perspective, going, I'm happy to lose 3-0. And for me, that's why I have to consider it, in many ways, a PSG capitulation. And that's just a factor that I wanted to add in there. But do you agree with me or Josh on that one?
I do agree with you. I feel like PSG were pretty lackadaisical, to be honest. They were coming into that game with a 4-goal lead against Barcelona. Of course, you can't take any chances against Barcelona as Barca proved. But Unai Emery will be absolutely kicking himself after that. He has thrown away a 4-goal lead against one of the best teams in the world, and they could have gone through to the quarterfinals of the Champions League at their expense. You just can't take your chances against a team like Barca with the quality of players that they have up and down the pitch. I mean, that's not to take away anything from what Barcelona did, because I would say they performed out of their skin, but no, they were performing like Barcelona do. Yeah. And they showed up PSG for their mistake of just taking it slow and just being happy to let Barcelona play their game rather than let PSG play their own. And they suffered for it.
So I know that Alex, that you mentioned that you wanted us to pinpoint either Barcelona playing really well or PSG being a bit complacent.
Yeah.
I think this is a prime example of how it's actually a combination of the two. And as I said, one was conducive to the other, because we had, at the end of the day, Barcelona could have been playing their socks off, but if PSG had also been performing to an equal standard, then Barcelona would have got 2 or 3 goals maximum and they'd still have gone out. likewise, if Barcelona had been quite deflated and PSG remained quite complacent, then it would have just been a 0-0 draw. So I think it's definitely a case of Barcelona being right at the top of their game and PSG not taking them seriously at all.
Fair enough. Well, we could debate that one pretty much till the cows come home. For me, obviously, Josh says it's a combination. The impression I got from you, Chris, is that you kind of agree with Josh on that one, that it was very much a combination of the two.
Yeah, I do.
For me, the tactical error of Unai Emery very much outshines the Barcelona performance. For me, I think it was an absolute dreadful performance for him to come out with, and it's something that I think we might see quite a lot with Unai Emery. I'm not sure if he's a Champions League manager. I think we can look at his European pedigree in the sense that he won 3 Europa Leagues in a row, but all off the back of going out of the Champions League in the group stages.
Yeah.
So is he a European bottler? Remains to be seen. But we don't want to dwell on this for too long. So we'll move on from the Barcelona PSG game, as amazing as it was, and we'll talk about a couple of the other Champions League games. We'll skip over Arsenal because I don't think any of us are surprised by the fact they went out to Bayern, regardless of the manner that they did. And we spoke about Wenger in a row before.
Yeah.
So one of the most amazing stories from the Champions League, obviously, is Leicester going through to the quarterfinals, having struggled in the league this year and sacked Ranieri and still managed to come out and beat Sevilla 2-0. And Josh, I'll come to you first on this one. Are you surprised that Leicester managed to come out 2-0 winners against what is a very, very strong Sevilla side?
I think, as I mentioned a few weeks ago, there are some really clear parallels between Mourinho being sacked from Chelsea last season and that signifying a resurgence in form of that Chelsea side under Hiddink, to Leicester having won the league last season, not performing this season, Ranieri gets sacked, and then someone new comes in and they suddenly found their form again. I think it's obvious that they just weren't playing for the manager. And I think that these rumours that they wanted Ranieri out, they must be true. Because you don't just start playing well after in 2 games just because the greatest manager in their history has been sacked. It's because they weren't playing for him. They, for whatever reason, weren't agreeing with his tactics. Craig Shakespeare's now in the hot seat and suddenly they're performing. I think it's no coincidence. So I think yes and no in terms of can we be surprised. Yes, because of the abysmal league form they've displayed. But no, because they've been performing in the Champions League firstly. And secondly, they're just obviously trying to turn on the heat for Craig Shakespeare now, and I think it's quite sad.
Yeah, fair enough. And Chris, I'll come to you for this one because I think this possibly raises a much larger point in terms of English clubs' European performance, because Leicester City are now the only remaining English team going into the quarterfinals of the Champions League. And I mean, go back a decade and you would have regularly at least 2 English teams in the semi-finals.
Yeah, often there were 3.
And yeah, often there were 3, and we're only seeing Leicester in the last 8. And obviously looking at last 8, it's a list of very, very strong teams. Do you think that this spells out, do you think that this is the biggest sign we've had yet of just the general decline in English football, that a team like Leicester City are going further in the Champions League than any other English side? Or do you think that's more of just an indication of how strong the other leagues are at the moment?
I think it's more a case of the teams taking the Premier League more seriously than they are the Champions League, because there's a lot more direct revenue to come from the Prem, because of course it's for an entire season rather than the Champions League, which yes is over a whole season, but it's far more spaced out. You can get far more money from your domestic league because of there's far more games to play, there's far more home legs, of course, and you can generate a lot more revenue from that. While of course the prestige of being European champions is there, the prestige of being English champions just seems to be far more attractive for teams at the moment. And I mean, if you look at, I'd take Spurs as a prime example, because they always push for top 4 finish and then just completely bottle it in Europe. That may not be because they just don't take the Champions League seriously. I mean, Spurs would love a good run in the Champions League, but they're just not good enough. So instead they just rest all their good players so that they can get qualification next year. It makes no sense. But I don't know where I'm really going with this point, but
Can I just respond to that? I do think it signals a decline in English football, but not quite for those reasons. If you take the Manchester United and Chelsea squads, for example, from the 2008 final.
Okay.
Obviously, that's probably the peak of English football, having 2 teams in the most prestigious final there is. If you look at the squads, they weren't, apart from maybe Cristiano Ronaldo, world-class players in either of those squads. There were like obviously decent, like Frank Lampard's a very good player.
Spread around.
I think
Didier Drogba was Didier Drogba still there at that point as well?
Yeah.
For Chelsea, yeah.
But if you, I mean, I'm talking like
Yeah.
the elite players, sort of like
Yeah,
top
yeah.
5. Whereas nowadays, I think that the Premier League teams are too dominated by these big name players, and it doesn't work. And I don't quite know what it will take for these managers to realise that for whatever reason, these big names just aren't seeming to work. Like, take Paul Pogba; he's nowhere near justified his £89 million price tag. Take Fernando Torres, for example. I mean, he got the goal in the semi-final when they won the Champions League with Chelsea, but he was nowhere near justifying his price tag.
But I think just to respond to that, I think that making a point about big players not working, I think that's a really interesting point to make, just purely because I think the teams that are dominating the Champions League at the moment are teams that are absolutely chock full of big players.
Yeah, but I think that works in the
already
European
discussed
leagues, though,
MSN.
because they're European players, and that's my point. Before, they were signing unknown players and making them into big players, which would then fit the squad. Whereas now they're buying ready-made big stars, throwing them into this team, buying them for ridiculous amounts of money, and it's just not working out.
Why do you think that is, though? Like, I'll throw this one out to both of you, because it's a really interesting general point. Why do you think it is that, like, the likes of Ronaldo, Bale, Suarez, Messi, Neymar, all of those can go off to Real Madrid or Barcelona and work in a team of essential Galacticos, like a team of absolute world beaters? But when players, potentially you could argue that could be of that caliber, obviously Paul Pogba is less proven than the likes of those people, but that have justified potentially an 89 million price tag coming to the English league, they don't settle down as well. Why do you think that is?
Names make money. That's purely what it is. Man United knew that when they signed Paul Pogba for £89 million, that they would make that money back, no problem.
They didn't know that he was going to flop,
Especially
though.
with TV deal.
Sorry? The point, they didn't know he was going to flop. So they obviously bought him. They bought him, yes, because he was a big name signing and he would generate lots of shirt income, for example. But you have to say that the primary reason for signing him was because he was supposed to be a world-class player. And I think that's the issue. I think these bigger name players are used to playing in the European leagues, and the English league is completely different from any other European league and any other world league. The style of play is completely different. The factor that a team like Leicester can go on and win the league, the fact that the title race is open to, generally speaking, 5 or 6 teams still. You don't get that anywhere else in Europe, and I think that's the issue. It's like Paul Pogba was in a one-team league. Real Madrid and Barcelona dominate a 2-team league. And the list goes on with this. Even PSG, not so much this season, but I think that was what was so surprising about Zlatan, that he adapted from a one-team league into, United might be 6, but he's still scoring goals left, right and centre. And he's probably a rarity in these big-name signings that are proving themselves in the Premier League.
Well, it's a really interesting general point to look at, but we've been talking about it for a long time. We do need to move on because there's plenty of other stuff to talk about, but that's some really interesting Champions League chat. But we will move on to our number of the week this week, which is 13. And I'll throw this one out to both of you, of course, as we always do. What could number 13 actually signify this week? And Josh, I'll throw this to you first.
Okay, well, speaking of Paul Pogba, is it how many £1 million is each of his hairstyles worth?
I think it might be arguably more than that, actually. Chris?
Is it how old did everybody say they were in order to sign up for Facebook when they were like 9 years old?
Thing is, that was just accurate, though. Like, although actually, I think I might be currently 25 on Facebook, which one of you pointed out to me a couple of weeks ago. But anyway, Josh, what
this is one for you, Laffrey. Is it how many more Premier League titles have United won than Liverpool?
Chris? You're hurting me. That got me right here.
That was the point.
Okay, so the number 13 is commonly referred to as a baker's dozen. After a new sponsorship deal with Sunbet, is it now called the Wayne Shaw dozen?
Nice try, Chris.
Wait. Oh, unlucky Chris.
that was a crap joke.
I may or may not have kicked him.
No, I know.
Given the height that I set early on with that Home Alone,
Do you know what? That aside, I'm just
This
so
is
glad
just-
we got through this without any nonce jokes coming up.
that joke just crashed more than Roberto Firmino.
Can you kick him again?
Okay, I'll stop now.
Yeah,
It's
you
derailed
stop
completely.
when Chris stops.
Right, go on, stay back on track. Josh, calm down. Deep breaths.
What have you done, Alex? What have you done?
This isn't even, we're too far gone for outtakes. It's the real thing.
There might have to be a hard cut here, or just
Director's
right.
cut. Chris's
Josh,
cut.
Come on, compose yourself. What is their number 13 actually signifying?
Following Aitor Karanka's sacking from Middlesbrough, it's how many games Borough had actually lost this season.
Of course, yeah, Aitor Karanka controversially sacked on the day of us recording this at the moment, leaving David Moyes as the only manager in a relegation battling side that's actually been there since the start of the season. I mean, I guess the obvious question, and I'll throw it to Chris while Josh calms himself down a little bit.
While I'm
You know me
fucking
too well.
connected.
I'll throw this to Chris. Should Karanka have been sacked? Yes or no?
If I were Borough at this point in the season, I honestly wouldn't have sacked him. I mean, we spoke a bit about how Karanka sets up a team to defend rather than score.
Yeah.
And Borough have had, I think it's the 5th best defence in the entire league this season.
I'm just having a look at that now. Yes, you're right. Joint 5th best defence in the league.
That's a good memory. But their problem was, of course, with their goal-scoring threat in that there was pretty much none. I think it was only 16 goals that they've scored this entire season.
19 in 27.
Oh, I was just talking about in the league. Never mind. When you have a star,
Can you kick him
when you have
again
a
for his
star player
cheek?
I'll let him leave this time. We'll call that strike one.
even though you kicked me twice.
Fine. Carry on.
But
Ignore
when
it.
you have a goal-scoring threat like Alvaro Negredo, you really should be scoring more. Karanka set up a team to defend, and that was paying relative dividends for Middlesbrough early on in the season. I wouldn't have sacked Karanka because he'd been at Borough for I think it was 3.5 years, and he finally returned them to the Premier League. And I guess some managers just aren't cut out for it. But even if Borough had gone down, I'd have kept him to fight for promotion next season for sure.
Fair enough. And Josh, do you agree? Obviously, Karanka's Middlesbrough, well, no longer Karanka's Middlesbrough, but are sitting in 19th in the Premier League table. The board might have come to them and said, aim is to stay in the Premier League, and they've seen the likes of Leicester be rejuvenated by a very controversial managerial change. If you were the Middlesbrough board, would you think you would have sacked Karanka as well?
I don't think I would have, but I don't know if you guys remember at the end of last season when they did get promotion, there were these rumours that he'd actually quit because he had problems with the board. So I'm actually really surprised that he's lasted this long, given that he obviously had tensions that clearly haven't been resolved. But I don't always think that a change in management is helpful to a relegation battle. Take Villa, for example. I know that Villa are a bit of a lost cause, but I just think that Karanka, he knows the squad. He's been there for a few years. It's not like he just come in this season. That you could possibly understand slightly more, but it's a bit like with Burnley keeping Sean Dyche. Yes, they went down after getting promoted, but now they've come back up the season after, and now they're flying. So that could very easily happen to Middlesbrough, or it could have happened if they'd kept him. So I don't always think that sacking a manager is conducive to staying up.
Yeah, this is very reminiscent of another northeastern side last season in the form of Newcastle. They sacked
True.
They sacked Steve McLaren at around this point in the season and appointed Rafa Benitez. Didn't work out, so I feel like the same is just going to happen to Middlesbrough. They're too far into the season for any real change to come.
Well, if I remember correctly, I think there was a statistic, and Rafa Benitez only contributed to this, where at the point at which Rafa Benitez was appointed, which I think may have even been earlier than this point in the season we're currently at now, no manager that was managing a relegation battling side that came in at that point in the season had ever managed to keep them up, regardless of who it was.
Yeah.
And if Rafa Benitez can't do it, I can't imagine who Middlesbrough are going to get in who could help them be the ones to be that stat. So it'll be very interesting to see if they do manage to achieve that. But one team that, like, as we mentioned briefly, hasn't actually sacked their manager, the only relegation side that haven't sacked their manager, are Sunderland, who have still kept hold of David Moyes for the moment. Simple question going out to either of you who want to answer it. Would you still keep David Moyes? Do you think he's doing a good enough job? Do you think a different manager could come in and perhaps boost Sunderland out of the relegation zone?
I'd keep him. As I said about Karanka, I don't think that sacking a manager is helpful, really. Unless, the thing is, with the Leicester situation, I agree that Ranieri shouldn't have been sacked. But if there's tension between players and the manager, I think it's normal that you're going to sack the manager over the players just because of tension. I don't think that's the case at Sunderland. And I think that, say Sunderland do get relegated, I think that he could probably bring them back up again. I quite like Jermaine Defoe as well. He's just being put back into the England squad. So I think that David Moyes is very much capable of getting the best out of his players. And I think with him it is a case of just perhaps getting his tactics slightly wrong as opposed to losing the players' faith. But I think like Sunderland are getting relegated and going down without a fight like Villa last season, for example. There's not that much in it between Sunderland and sort of even teams in 16th and 15th, really. So in a few games' time, it could very easily be a different story. So I think it would be a bit premature to get rid of Moyes a bit of an oxymoron, a bit premature to get rid of him this far into the season.
I mean, I think that's a bit of a controversial thing you said there, Josh, because, I mean, you said there's not that much difference between them and the teams in 16th and 15th. The teams in 16th and 15th both have 27 points, and Sunderland are 8 points off that. And, I mean, they have a game in hand of one of those sides, but would you back Sunderland to really get 3 points in that game of hand?
Stranger things have happened.
Probably not.
Definitely
Strange
not.
things have happened, but, I mean, I'd be very surprised, regardless of what Sunderland did with their manager, if they stayed up this season. And, Chris, I'll just very quickly throw it to you as well. I mean, will David Moyes consider himself too big for Sunderland if they do go down? Do you think he'll stay if they do go down? And therefore, like, taking that into account, should they keep him?
If he considered himself too big for Sunderland, he wouldn't have joined them in the first place because, let's be honest, as soon as the season began, Sunderland were candidates for relegation. And to be completely honest, I don't understand why Moyes hasn't been sacked already. I mean, he's been nothing short of terrible with Sunderland.
But is he doing anything different to what the previous 4 managers have done? This is season in, season out for Sunderland.
This problem extends to more than just the manager. I feel like the players that Sunderland have, bar Jermaine Defoe, just really aren't good enough for the Premier League. There's very few players in that Sunderland side who I could actually see getting into any other Premier League team in the top half.
I think you could probably limit it to, I mean, Van Aanholt moved in January to Crystal Palace already. Yep. He was one. Jermaine Defoe, you've already mentioned. Papi Djilabodji has been pretty decent for Sunderland so far this season. I would say he's Premier League quality. And Jordan Pickford
is another who I would say has been relatively solid, but he's been
injured. All right, yeah. And obviously Jordan Pickford.
I was going to say him actually, yeah.
But I mean, aside from that, you're looking at championship caliber players, really.
Yeah, and I feel like it's in a similar vein to what Middlesbrough should have done with Karanka. Sunderland are pretty much dead certs to go down, but if they do keep hold of Moyes, I feel like going down, similarly to what's happened with Villa, going down is probably the best thing that could happen to Sunderland for there to be genuine change coming through.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, and I think that the last thing to take account really with that is the fact that Sunderland traditionally, when they've stayed up, have had managers that have a bit of experience in the relegation scrap. They're not going to bottle it in the same way that when a manager and a team that have never experienced a title challenge before go into a title challenge with no idea how to do it. A lot of the time they do fail in terms of like actually winning the title. The likes of Tottenham last season, obviously Leicester were a massive exception to that. I think with relegation scrap, Moyes is not used to a relegation.
But you say that when he took over Everton, when he took over Everton in 2001-2, I think they were second bottom. They were really struggling under Walter Smith. Yeah, and that's why he got the sack, and that's why Moyes took over, and he steered them to a pretty safe finish, and then he built on that, and he got them into the Champions League qualifying rounds. To say that he's got no experience in relegation, I would say is slightly unfair. Even if they weren't 19th, they were still bottom quarter of the league, so they weren't flying like Everton are nowadays. So he's definitely had experience in the lower depths of the Premier League without question.
But his experience there was more cleaning up the mess of another manager rather than being in a relegation battle from the start, I'd say. But
well, I think that's a harder job. Having even less time.
Well, either way, we could, again, it's another one we could argue for a very long time, because obviously none of us know what's going to happen, but I think I'm certainly with Chris in the opinion that perhaps not necessarily that Moyes should be sacked or should have been sacked, but I think Sunderland at this point are pretty much dead certain to go down. But speaking of Sunderland, and we've mentioned Jermaine Defoe a couple of times already, provides quite a nice segue into talking about the England squad, which has again just been announced pretty much today, with a certain Jermaine Defoe being recalled up to the squad at the age of 34. And there are quite a few interesting names in that England squad that have been called up, likes of Jake Livermore, Michael Keane, who I'm personally very, very happy to have seen called up, and obviously Jermaine Defoe. So obvious question is, what do you guys think of the names that have been called up to that squad?
What I like about Southgate's choices is that unlike his predecessors, he's not picking big names necessarily. He's picking players that he, as England manager, sees fit for the fixture, the round of fixtures. So Hodgson was just fielding an 11 of names. Capello was... Yeah. I don't even want to talk about Fabio Capello's reign. McLaren...
What was further in the World Cup than Hodgson did?
Yes, not saying much.
Yeah, that's really not saying a lot.
Steve McLaren...
I'm a less morally abhorrent person than Adolf Hitler. That's an achievement.
I've had more romantic success than Chris.
Wow.
I've got better hair than Alex.
Adam Johnson.
Brilliant.
No,
quality. I knew a non-joke.
Steve McLaren, back to the question in hand, dropped David Beckham as a statement. And I think it's a bit of a back catalogue of these events, whereas Gareth Southgate isn't taking any of this on board. He's thinking, I'm England manager, I'm going to do things my way. I'm not going to worry about what anyone else thinks. I'm not going to do it because this person might get upset or this team might get upset because this player's not been picked. He's picked a group of players that he thinks have been performing well this season. Whether we agree with him or not is a different matter. But he's picked a squad that he thinks has performed very well this season and warrants a place in the England setup. And I think that's something we can only commend.
I think that's very fair. And I'm just looking at the squad now, and I'm trying to think of people that I think perhaps should be in there and haven't got the call-up. But I mean, in terms of form, we're looking at Tom Heaton, who's definitely warranted a call-up with his form for Burnley this season, alongside, as I already mentioned, Michael Keane.
James
Ward-Prowse.
Nathan Redmond is another.
Exactly. And Jesse Lingard obviously has played a few times, got another call-up, and I think some of his performances in the games where he has played for Man United perhaps definitely warrant that. But but just two things that I perhaps don't necessarily agree with are the fact that, and I don't think he's injured, but obviously hasn't been getting the game time. I don't know if he's been getting the game time. He may well have done. But he's certainly not been getting the game time for Arsenal, which is Danny Welbeck, who, when he has played for Arsenal, has been, in my opinion, very, very good. So I think leaving him out, considering the lack of strikers we've got at the moment in terms of injury, is a little bit controversial. And in his place, Jamie Vardy being called up from Leicester, obviously, to the England squad, having not played particularly well over the course of the season. But we're having a little bit of a discussion about this one just before the podcast, and so makes for an interesting discussion point now. And I'll throw this out to you, Josh, because you've got an opinion that certainly disagrees with mine. I would personally have Danny Welbeck in the squad over Jamie Vardy. And you've argued, perhaps, that Jamie Vardy, based on the last couple of games that he's played, should be in the England squad. I'll throw this out to both of you. What do you guys both think about the striker choices based on the injuries that we've had that Gareth Southgate has made?
Well, if you're talking about... Oh, go on.
Yeah, thank you. I am still fucking here.
There's no need for that language, Chris.
That's strike two, Chris. We don't need any of that.
Yeah.
No, I definitely have given Danny Welbeck a call up. I mean, in the few games that he has played for Arsenal, the one that springs to mind is Arsenal's FA Cup match against Southampton, where they won 5-0 and Welbeck scored 2 goals.
Yeah.
I mean, when he plays incredibly well, and he, in my opinion, should actually be starting for Arsenal. Because
I completely agree with you.
He's just wasting himself at that club and should probably move elsewhere. But including Jamie Vardy, what is Southgate doing? I mean, he's been absolutely dreadful this season if you look at the entire season, excluding the last 2 or 3 games where he's been showing the same sort of form that he was last season. He certainly doesn't warrant an England call-up, and Danny Welbeck should ultimately be in his place. As for England's other 2 striking options in the current squad, I'm not sure where I stand on Rashford. I mean, when he's played for England, he has been very, very good. I mean, he's shown the determination and maturity of someone far beyond his years. And Jermaine Defoe has been, like I said earlier, the one standout player for Sunderland. And with the injuries that we currently have, I mean, he is perhaps one of the best options there for.
100%.
So, yeah, if I were Gareth Southgate, I'd have called up Welbeck in place of Vardy.
Yeah, fair enough. And just to put a little case up in defence of Marcus Rashford, and I'm sure Josh would have done this and will probably agree with me on this. Rashford isn't getting played in his natural position at Manchester United, which I think is fair because you have to accommodate Zlatan Ibrahimovic in that team because he's been so crucial to them. But I mean, which game was it where Rashford was playing up front because Ibrahimovic was banned?
The Chelsea
I think
game.
it was last weekend.
This is Monday.
It was literally the Chelsea game, yeah.
Chelsea.
And I mean, Rashford showed glimpses against probably arguably the strongest defence in the league of like real signs of talent. I mean, there was one point where he collected the ball on the halfway line, had 3 defenders to take it past, managed to do so, and unfortunately had his shot saved by Courtois. So, Josh, I'll throw this over to you because I'm sure you agree with me on the Rashford point. Jamie Vardy, should he be in the England team or not at this point?
I think, just to sort of touch on what Chris was saying, it was slightly contradictory that Jamie Vardy is in form but shouldn't have been picked because of how he's been doing the rest of the season. International selection is a form-based game. And if he's been showing the form in the last 2 games that he showed last season, that's exactly the reason why he should be picked for the England setup. In terms of Rashford, in terms of yeah, well, it could be a slight run of form for him. But in terms of Rashford, I don't think you can ever be too young to be selected for the England setup. If you're good enough, then you're old enough, essentially. And I think that the experience...
Said Adam Johnson.
I was waiting for Chris to make that joke,
Not
actually. And look, he's at one of the... He's at one of the world's... Rashford's at one of the world's biggest clubs, and he might not be in his preferred position, but he's still starting quite a fair few games for someone of his age.
Yeah.
And to get that experience at the age of 19 is invaluable. And I know that we talk about Wayne Rooney having been perhaps a wasted talent, but Wayne Rooney was in that England setup from, I think, the age of 18. And he then went on to be captain of club and country. So who said that Rashford can't do the same thing? I think Southgate has been very, very... very, very...
True, in his choices.
Very, very wise, I think, is quite a good adjective to use, because he's potentially thinking about not just the 2 games that are coming up, but thinking about what it can do for the squad in the future. Because it's, generally speaking, it's not an old squad that he's picked, and the average age is going to be pretty young. So
one team as well.
Yeah, to quote Adam Johnson, this is probably one for the future in terms of a squad. So,
or to quote about Moussa Dembele,
the concentration of nonce jokes is just going up and up and up and up.
But it was
like something else that's nonce related.
I hate you so much,
guys.
Guys.
So to say that Marcus Rashford, so it's the argument. If say there was an argument that he shouldn't be picked for X, Y, Z reason, I think the reasons that he should be picked are he's good enough. He's been playing pretty well in one of the world's best clubs, generally speaking. Maybe not at the moment, but just generally speaking. And he can cope with the pressure of being on the world stage. He did it. He's done it for England before. He's done it for United on several occasions. So he's a great example of a player that England needs at this moment in time.
Well, fair enough. Just before we move on, just to respond to the Jamie Vardy point. You mentioned that in terms of form in the last couple of games, he's scored a couple of goals and players should be picked on form, which I think is a fair point, but he's had so many chances in those 2 games. I watched a lot of the highlights from the Sphere game. Unfortunately, I didn't get to watch the whole game, but I mean, he had some absolute one-on-one chances that last season you would have put your house on him burying in the bottom corner. there's one in particular, I can't remember the passage of play, but he had loads of space basically on the penalty spot, and basically blasted it into Rosette. And he's not a player at the moment with high on confidence, regardless of the goals he's scored. He's so wasteful, and I would personally argue that, regardless of the fact he's scored 2 goals, that he's currently not on form. I think that he's as out of sorts as he has been the rest of the season. But, I mean, everything else you said there, especially about Marcus Rashford, are things that I totally agree with. But we can't talk about the England squad for too long. I think we'll all agree that in terms of the players Gareth Southgate's picked, it shows quite a lot of promise in terms of the method by which he's picking England players, not just picking on names. So that's hopefully something that's really positive that we'll see progress throughout the rest of his England reign. But moving on, we're running a little bit short on time, I think, so as that was a very good debate, but we'll move on to the actual scheduled debate, which is, of course, the dugout debate. And this time, it's about the best comeback of all time. And one of us has gone for a very, very rogue pick this week. Hopefully,
which
try
Alex and I are going to
redeem some of the dignity
absolutely
he
destroy.
lost with some of his other slightly rogue picks in other weeks. And we're going to go to him first. So obviously we'll go around, all three of us. We'll all say a little piece on why we picked what we picked, and then we'll go into trying to sort of take down each other's points. So Chris, I will come to you first. What is the best comeback? Apart from Barca PSG, because we weren't allowed to pick that one.
Well, you're right in that this one's sort of come a bit out of the blue. I did go very far back in time to find this one. It's the 1953 FA Cup final between Blackpool and Bolton.
Just kick him that free.
I was
We'll take
tempted.
this one.
I'm
We'll
actually
take this
very
one between us.
Blackpool
I'm very interested
4,
to hear his case here.
Blackpool 4, Bolton 3. When you look at those two teams, of course, now they're having completely different forms to what they were then. I mean, Blackpool have had absolutely abhorrent owners for a while, and Bolton have, of course, had their massive financial and tax issues. But back then, of course, it's still a local rivalry, so that's an added factor to the fixture, of course. Bolton were leading 2-1 at half-time, and then it was 3-1 to the Trotters on the 55-minute mark. And then probably one of Blackpool's best players ever, Stan Mortensen, he scores a hat-trick. And that is still to this day the only hat-trick that has ever been scored in an FA Cup final. And that was completed with just a minute left of normal time to play. And then Bill Parry went on to score the winner in the 92nd minute, which is fairly reminiscent of Fergie time. And then this is at the old Wembley Stadium in front of a crowd of 100,000 people. Back in 1953, before you had all the mass TV coverage that you do nowadays, a turnout of 100,000 people is absolutely incredible. And even one of Bolton's players, Nat Lofthouse, according to a number of sources, he applauded once that final goal went in.
Is that source Wikipedia?
Yes, this is from Wikipedia.
A number of sources.
Information.
Sorry, French
He
Wikipedia,
applauded.
English Wikipedia.
applauded a rival team scoring against them in the dying minutes of the FA Cup final. That is not something you would see nowadays, and it just goes to show that perhaps old football was better.
Right, it's an interesting argument. There's a few things I want to pick up on that, but obviously we'll do that once we've all said our piece. Josh, obviously I'll go to you next.
Yeah, well,
I don't think there'll be any prizes for guessing what Josh's comeback is going to be, but I'll throw it to you anyway.
I think if you say the words comeback, I think for a lot of people, the immediate match that springs to mind is the 1999 Champions League final between Manchester United and Bayern Munich. And if you look at, I think, I'll touch on this with mainly Chris's in the sort of rebuttal part of it. The whole point of a comeback isn't, in my opinion, just a match. It's about a team. It's about what the comeback means for that team in that season, not just the context of the one game. And if you take this one game at the end of a very, very long season for the club, that Champions League title was the third part of the treble, which it was unprecedented at the time and hasn't been in England since, and may never will be done again. Who knows? It was a typical Alex Ferguson team. It was the epitome of everything that man had achieved and had built upon since he joined in 1986. From going back from, I think it was like 1994-95, when Alan Hansen said you can't win anything with kids. Well, you bloody well can, because we did it. All these, it's just so many factors saying why this is such a great comeback. From the point of view that, game upon game that season, we'd been behind and we came back to win. This was just beyond a single isolated game. This was the mentality of a Manchester United team that was capable of overturning deficits to win vital matches at vital times. We did it against Juventus in the semi-final when Andy Cole managed to get the goal in the sort of dying embers of that match to send us through to the final. And then if you take the final itself, we played absolutely dreadfully in that match, and yet we still managed to get 2 goals. It showed the spirit of that Manchester United team and the spirit of Sir Alex Ferguson, or Alex Ferguson as he was then, that you can play completely terribly against one of the world's greatest teams and still win and achieve not just that one title, but to have achieved 3 titles, the 3 biggest titles you can achieve as an English club. It's just remarkable. And then if you also look at what United built upon after that treble winning season, we won the league for the next 2 seasons. I think we went on to win the league a further 4 or 5 times after that, amongst a plethora of other trophies. So it just goes to show what an amazing feat that was, that it wasn't just a case of the comeback in the match. And yes, we obviously the match in the last 3 minutes were arguably the most exciting 3 minutes that's ever been in football history. But as I was alluding to at the beginning, a comeback is more than just one match, in my opinion. And for all of the factors that comeback for Man United represents, to me it shows why that's the best comeback of all time.
Fair enough. Very strong case made there. And interestingly, there are obviously some differences. There are a lot of parallels I would draw between the match you've just described and the way you described it, and the way that I would describe my totally not completely obvious pick, which is, of course, the Istanbul final, where Liverpool came back to draw 3-3 with it, AC Milan, and then win on penalties. Because, I mean, like you said, in that first half, we were, similar to Manchester United, we were absolutely dreadful in that first half. And obviously, everyone knows that in the end, it was there was a 10-minute madness where we just scored 3 goals and we managed to hold out for the rest of the game and then eventually win on penalties. And the reason that I think this is so significant is partly because of, again, what I said that was similar to Josh, which was that we played terribly and then managed to pick it up in the second half. One of the main reasons I think this is so mental was just the golfing class between those 2 sides at the time. Now, don't get me wrong, Liverpool's side at the time was not bad. We had Gerrard pretty much either just before or just getting to his absolute prime, which was hugely influential. But I mean, when you look at that AC Milan side, they were by absolutely miles the best team in Europe. They had the likes of Nesta, Stam, Maldini in defence. They had Gattuso. They had Shevchenko. They had Pirlo. Their entire team was incredible. And Liverpool's entire team was definitely not. There was no way going into that half-time 3-0, AC Milan would have ever thought that Liverpool side could have come back. And the spirit that was shown by the Liverpool side, inspired by Steven, what I believe to be, with the possible exception of the Olympiacos game in the same Champions League run, Steven Gerrard's potential best performance in a Liverpool shirt. Obviously, the West Ham FA Cup final could be argued as well. Inspired by their captain, against all the odds, against a team that was much better than them, on such a big stage, for a club that wasn't at the time at their best in the league or anything like that. For me, that makes it, in every way possible, just one of the most incredible comebacks we will ever see in football. But we've all made our cases now, and now's the bit where we go and try and basically destroy each other's arguments. And as much as I hate to be a bully, I think there's probably really only going to be one starting point for 2 of us here.
Yeah.
And Josh, I'll be kind enough to let you take this first.
All right. Well, obviously, I'm going to start with you, Chris. To bring back one of my arguments from when I was stating my case, that it was about a team. With Blackpool, apart from, was it Mortensen and Stanley Matthews?
Stanley Matthews.
Who else in that Blackpool team contributed to them overturning that deficit?
Bill Parry, he scored the final goal.
Who else?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Testing your Wikipedia knowledge now, boy.
The thing is, my point is, With the United, I don't know how Blackpool season panned out during the 52-53 season. I don't know how they finished. With United, the entirety of that squad was world class. Like Peter Schmeichel, who was perhaps Buffon and Van der Sar aside, the greatest goalkeeper in the world at that point. If you take the defence, Gary Neville, Jaap Stam, Ronnie Johnson, and probably Phil Neville or Dennis Irwin, one of the two. And then I know that Scholes and Keane were actually banned for that match, but they were still part of the team. We had,
Of course they were.
we had David Beckham, Jesper Blomqvist, Nicky Butt, Ryan Giggs, and then the starting strikers were Cole and York, who one of the deadliest combinations as we spoke about in a few weeks ago. One of the
I just point out, it's very impressive that you remember that team completely off
Yeah.
by heart. That's quite impressive.
I use Wikipedia wisely. Cole and York, one of the, like we said, one of the best partnerships has ever been in the Premier League. And then if you take the subs bench of Solskjaer and Sheringham, they came on into a game that they had played no part in whatsoever, fitted in absolutely perfectly, and managed to get 2 goals in the dying ends of the match. It was a case of having an entire squad's worth of players that can contribute to overturning a deficit and making it into one of the greatest triumphs football's ever seen. Whereas with Blackpool, I'm not saying it wasn't a great comeback, because it was a great comeback. It's remarkable in the FA Cup final to overturn the 3-1 deficit and to win 4-3. But you can't just pick out 3 players and say it was because of only these 3 players that this comeback was amazing. I think it has to be, with most comebacks, with Barcelona's comeback, for example, it was a team effort. It was about the whole team galvanising together, working out a method of overturning the deficit and grinding out a result. And I think that's probably what differentiates the modern game from the classic game, if you like. I agree with you that football isn't as good as it used to be. And in those days, it was about individual players more than teams. But nowadays, it's more of a team game than individual players. And probably you will have more legendary teams than players in the modern era. But I still think that argument will completely outweigh any argument of having individual players contributing to a great comeback.
Well,
just to add, I would say rebuttal, but no, this is just sort of holding up like a piece of cardboard to try and defend myself. But you're right that it's not necessarily about the one match; it's about the team. This comeback for a team like Blackpool, it's not just about the team; it's about the club, and that game for that club means an immense amount to them. I mean, it's the only FA Cup they've won. In the league, I've just done a check. They finished 7th, which fair enough. That's a good performance with 19 wins. Yes, you're right about the individual players meaning a lot more back in those days. Stan Mortensen had a statue put outside Bloomfield Road, which was removed by the owners because the fans were protesting, but that's beside the point. What this match meant to the fans and the club, because of its smaller relative size to Liverpool and Manchester United, that's sort of like my only real defence of this, besides what I've already said. It means far more to a team like Blackpool than a team like Man United, who in that season had already won the league and the FA Cup.
But surely that means more to Blackpool fans nowadays than it did at the time. And I think that's the point. With Blackpool now lingering in League Two, they're probably still clutching on to that FA Cup of 1953 like there's no tomorrow.
If it were good enough, 100,000 people at Wembley.
Yeah, but that was also when it was standing. The capacities were far bigger in those days.
But equally, just to throw a point against that particular. Interestingly, I think the point you've just made, Chris, in terms of because we are looking back at comebacks now, and as much as we should also look at them in the context. I think the point you've just made about how much it probably meant to them comparatively to 2 worldwide very big clubs is actually a very strong one.
But United weren't big in that in that time either.
They were pretty.
In 1953.
Oh, in 1953, maybe not. But in terms of the context of the comebacks we're looking at now. So we're not looking at a Manchester United 1953 comeback. But anyway, I think that a couple of the points that I am not entirely on board with you, Chris, is this idea that the 100,000 capacity at Wembley somehow necessitates the comeback being better. I don't think that makes a difference. There's going to be 100,000 people at Wembley, regardless. It's not like the 4-3 comeback. Like, people heard, oi, Blackpool are doing a sick comeback, let's all pile into Wembley now. Like, it could have been a 1-0 game, there'd still be 100,000 people there. I don't think that makes a difference to the comeback, for a start.
I'm only saying it because of the amount of people who were there to watch it live, because back in those days, of course, like I said, there wasn't the massive TV coverage. It was a lot more difficult to get to a game because fewer people had cars, train tickets.
Oh, come on.
But equally, but I don't think that makes a difference to the. I don't think that necessitates it being a good comeback. So I think it's kind of a null point in and of itself. And Josh, just a little piece of rebuttal for you. And this was actually a point you made more in rebuttal to Chris's point, that to make your point stronger as well. The idea of it being like a colossal team effort and Man United's team being amazing, and that made the comeback better. I would actually argue that perhaps doesn't necessarily make the comeback better. I think one of the reasons for me why the Liverpool comeback is so special is because the comeback is part of the reason the comeback is so incredible is because it was such an underdog thing. Like, the quality of that AC Milan side was so much better than the quality of that Liverpool side. And therefore, to come back from 3-0 down is not only an achievement in and of itself. Like, for example, some people are putting the Barcelona PSG comeback down a little bit just purely because Barcelona are so good. Like, that Liverpool side from 0-0 should have never beaten that AC Milan side, let alone from 3-0 down. And don't get me wrong, Bayern Munich at the time were arguably the best team in the world, if not one of the best teams in the world. But I think you could also argue that at that time Manchester United were the best team in the world. So, like, for them to come back from 1-0 down, of course the circumstances and everything, it all happening in stoppage time with two substitutes who just came and slotted straight into the game is very impressive. But for me, the Liverpool one is so much more impressive because the whole team wasn't as quality as perhaps that Manchester United side was.
I'd also have to add to that the fact that it had to go to penalties. That just shows like how far to the wire it had to go to decide the teams, and that to me just makes it a better. Well,
for me, it makes it less of a comeback. The fact that that United managed to kill the game off I think that makes it far more exciting that in the dying embers of the game they scored twice. Don't get me wrong, it's an incredible comeback of Liverpool's to have overcome a 3-0 deficit and then to win the Champions League. But I think, personally, the penalties aspect makes it probably a bit more butterflies in the stomach at the time. But I think, looking back, it makes it less exciting. I think the impact of scoring 2 goals...
Really?
Yeah, I think the impact of scoring... I don't think a penalty shootout is a classic way to win any final, personally.
I think a penalty shootout is an extraordinarily memorable way to win a penalty shootout. But carry on.
Unless you're Simone Zaza, in which you'd rather forget your penalty shootouts, but that's for...
I don't think Simone Zaza's been involved in any particularly exciting comebacks, but...
No.
Josh, sorry, carry on your point.
Yeah, I think, for me, if I'm, just say as a neutral match, I would find it far more exciting to watch a team overcome a deficit in stoppage time than to win a match on penalties, whether they've come back or not. That's my personal opinion. You guys may disagree with that. I think it's far more exciting watching the game progress throughout the first 90 minutes, and then for the final 3 minutes, to compete against run of play, to turn it on and to score 2 goals. With the Liverpool match, for example, it's a case of having the 90 minutes, then the 30 minutes of extra time, and then the penalty shootout. It just becomes a bit long-winded. I'm not saying, like I reiterate, I'm not saying it's not an amazing comeback, but I think if you want to look at intensity and excitement, I think the 99 final completely outweighs the 05 final.
See, I would personally agree with that. Had the as much as I agree with the fact that potentially scoring 2 goals in stoppage time is more exciting than a penalty shootout, I think that negates the fact that despite the fact there were no goals scored from the 60th minute until the 120th in the Liverpool match, that was not exciting because it was anything but unexciting. I mean, it was after we scored those 3 goals, we had a 10-minute spell in which we were totally on top and scored 3 goals, and then it was all AC Milan again, and we were defending as doggedly as I've ever seen a Liverpool team defend in my life. Like, it's a far cry from what we're seeing with Ragnar Klavan and Joel Matip these days. Like, AC Milan had chance after chance after chance, and Jamie Carragher was heroic. There was, in particular, I can't remember how far it was from the end of the game, but I think it was Andrei Shevchenko had a double chance, and Jerzy Dudek pulled off one of the most incredible double saves I've ever seen in my life to just keep that game at 3-3 and take us to penalties. Like, we were playing for penalties by that point because it was the only way we were ever going to win that game. And I think that the way we were clinging on, it was almost as if everything was aligning for us to perhaps win that game, and then Shevchenko getting a bit cocky and chipping it down the middle, and Jerzy Dudek's little banana legs going all over the place. For me, the fact that it was just the way in which everything sort of aligned. It was a 10-minute spell of absolute madness for us, and then one of the most dogged defensive performances ever, which made it so exciting. Every single second of that game was heart in mouth for that Liverpool support in Istanbul and watching at home, regardless of the fact there were no goals scored. And I'd imagine it was the same for AC Milan. Excitement, frustration. That game had pretty much everything you could ever want from it, and that for me is why it was so unbelievably exciting.
I think if you don't watch the players when Solskjaer scores the winning goal in 99, if you watch the media, if you watch the Bayern Munich players, if you listen to the commentators, the sheer what the hell has just happened, I think it's just incredible, and it's something that you can never relive. I think it's more possible to relive overturning a 3-goal deficit and winning on penalties than it is to overturn a 1-0 deficit in stoppage time. Personally, I think if you just look at how deflated the Bayern Munich players were in terms of, we can't believe this just happened. If you look at the United bench racing over a case of, they can't believe this just happened. If you look at the media, obviously some of them were United fans, they were going completely berserk. Whereas I think with Liverpool, I don't know if anticlimax is the right word, but it peaks when they get the equalising goal, and then it sort of flatlines, and I think it remains that way until Dudek then has the winning save. Whereas with the United, it peaks at the moment at which we win it, and there's no other moment in that game matches that.
Well, fair enough. Obviously, we don't want to go on with this for too long. I think we've overrun a little bit anyway, so I'll leave it there. But all I'm going to say is, in terms of repeating that, I don't think there has been a situation in a final or anything like that where a 3-0 deficit has come back and then went on penalties. Obviously, 3-0 deficit has been overturned. Liverpool themselves suffered from that against Crystal Palace. But I mean, Manchester City overturned 2 goals in stoppage time to win the Premier League, to the same excited reaction from their own fans and bench, and deflation from obviously the Manchester United.
See, I would argue that's probably a more exciting comeback than Liverpool's.
Well, potentially, and I think we all have. I think part of the crux of this is that we have slightly different definitions of what makes a comeback good. Chris's dog in particular has a very loud opinion currently. But obviously, if you're watching and you've got to this point, do you think that Chris's comeback, in terms of how paramount it's ended up being in the history of the club, it makes it more important? Josh's definition of perhaps his comeback being more exciting based on the manner in which it happened being better, or perhaps my definition being of the golfing class between two sides and therefore it being more impressive makes it a better comeback. Let us know what you thought down below, and that pretty much brings us to the end of the Dugout debate. So again, thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next week, and until next time, we'll see you in the next one.
Bye, Chris.
Quality.
For more footballing news and views, like, follow, share and subscribe.